seeing the earth as our sacred home, a home that supports all life, and a home that is there to give us all that we need. Today is very much about looking at the responsibility that each of us have when it comes to caring for our home and caring for the planet. And it's a journey that each one of us has been on, understanding the sometimes complex issues when it comes to climate change, and each of us facing the choices that we are being asked to make as an individual to the whole. So our event today is called Making Choices That Care for Ourselves and the Planet, and it's hosted by the Brahmakumaris in collaboration with Faith for the Climate as part of the contribution to the Green Faiths initiative, Living the Change, Faithful Choices for a Flourishing World. My name is Philippa Blackham, and I'll be steering our conversation today with our speakers, who are each of them passionate about the role of the individual when it comes to making changes happen. We have a religious leader, a spiritual leader, and a leader in the field of scientific inquiry into the field of sustainability. So I think between us, it's going to be a very lively and engaging discussion. Let me introduce you to them right away. Our first speaker is the Reverend Canon Giles Goddard, who is the vicar of St. John's and St. Andrew's Church in Waterloo, in the heart of London. Now, Giles is also a member of the Church of England's Environment Group. He's initiated a few changes when it comes to that. He's a member of the Church's governing body, which is the General Synod. And he is the chairperson of Faith for the Climate, who's co-hosting our event today. Now, Faith for the Climate is an interfaith group which seeks to encourage and inspire all faith communities in their work and efforts on climate change. Giles, a very warm welcome to you. Thanks for being with us today, really appreciate it. Now, we also have Professor Dr. Mark Lawrence with us. Now, Mark is the Scientific Director at the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam in Germany. Welcome again to you, Mark. Thanks so much for being with us from Germany today. Now, your organisation aims to identify and promote development pathways for a global transformation towards a sustainable society. And Mark, your background has been in atmospheric science, so that means air pollution and climate change. But you also actively support the development of the whole person when it comes to looking at planetary health. Now, you're a scientist who also has a keen interest in faith and spirituality. So you bring with you this wonderful blend of science and spirituality. I find that really fascinating. So great to have you with us today. And finally, also based in London at Global Cooperation House, which is hosting our session today, we have Brahmakumari Sister Jayanti. Welcome to you, Sister Jayanti. Thanks so much for being with us today as well. Now, Sister Jayanti is the European Director of the Brahmakumaris, which is a worldwide spiritual organisation, and Jayanti has been part of that since the age of 19. Now, since 2009, Sister Jayanti has headed the Brahmakumaris delegation to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Conference of Parties, otherwise known as COP. And she's spoken widely on the link between consciousness and climate change. So welcome to you all. It might be nice to just begin with your own personal reflections of the moment when you really made a deep connection with this whole topic that we're discussing today of nature, the environment, and not just seeing it as something out there, but that other people are looking at and other people are going to fix and sort, but seeing it as something that I myself have to make a personal connection with and a personal commitment to. Maybe, Giles, we could start with you. Was there a defining moment?
There was. Thank you, Philippa, very much. And can I just say how delighted I am to be part of this webinar. I'm really looking forward to it. So I'd always, I grew up in the country in Sussex, and it was always kind of very close to the land. I did a lot of bird watching when I was a teenager, and I was aware of kind of the environmental challenges emerging. But about 10 years ago, I became vicar of St. John's Church in Waterloo, which is right at the heart of London. It's opposite Waterloo Station. So you might think that it was quite far removed from some of these climate and environmental issues. But within our parish, we have the headquarters of some international organisations, including one called Shell Oil. And we had a festival about soon after I started back in 2009. And I wrote round to all the local businesses for sponsorship, and I was given £1,000 by Shell, which I was very grateful for. So we put that on our flyer, sponsored by Shell. Looking back now, it's amazing, really. But shortly after the first flyer had gone out, a member of my congregation, who was called Siobhan Grimes, came to see me. She was a 19-year-old climate activist. And she came to see me and she said, "Giles, why are you taking sponsorship from Shell?" And I said, "Well, why shouldn't we? They're a local business. They're supporting our festival. It's good community relations, and it helps. We've got some money." And she'd come prepared with all the graphs, which are now very familiar to most of us, I guess. Identifying the direct connection between carbon dioxide and fossil fuels and so on. And although I'd been aware of it in the back of my head, it hadn't come forward really. But ever since that meeting, which was in this room, I remember it quite clearly, I've become much, much more engaged. And because of that, as you've mentioned, I put motions through the Church of England's General Synod, and a lot has happened as a result. But I often tell that story because it reminds me always that, activism makes a difference. Because if Siobhan hadn't come to see me, 19-year-old student, first year, King's College, then, none of the things which have happened since that I've been involved in would have happened. My involvement wouldn't have helped them forward. So that's a moment which I'm grateful for.
And amazing how your shift in consciousness was then able to direct motions for the Church of England Synod and bring about change throughout the entire Church of England. So, it's a real testimony to the power of the individual to make changes through whatever means you have at your disposal. Mark, if I can bring you in at this point, I mean, scientists, have been on a journey when it comes to not just poking and prodding the material world, but connecting with it emotionally and personally. What has your journey been like?
Well, sure. Well, first off, thank you very much to the Brahma Kumaris for putting this together and for the invitation to join you. And thanks, Philippa, for the introduction and for that opening question. Of course, it's a bit of a personal story, like Giles's story. And like Giles, when I was young, I spent a good bit of time in the woods, not bird watching, but rather hunting. I grew up in in suburban Georgia, and that was a part of our family's tradition, and got to know nature fairly well that way, and understood some of its great value in our lives, and really abhorred pollution. But I never really connected that so well with my professional life. And I went to college studying physics, and spent the last couple years of my undergraduate working every other semester with Michelin, the tire company. And I was very interested in cars, and it was fascinating work that we were doing, intellectually stimulating and even environmentally relevant. We were characterizing road surfaces to understand how they connect to tire noises and tire vibrations and things like that. And I felt very, very intellectually fulfilled and still very hollow inside. And one day driving back from work, John Lennon's song Imagine came on the radio, and it popped. I basically swelled up with tears and had to pull over the side of the road and realized this is not what I want to do with my life. There's nothing wrong with industry, in my view. There are people who are in industry that are leaders of industry that are doing a great job of transitioning towards sustainability. But as a scientist, that wouldn't be my role. So I went back to Georgia Tech and looked for other options and shifted into earth and atmospheric sciences and started working on environmental pollution issues, and have since then worked on trying to not only understand environmental pollution, but understand how we communicate about it and how we connect and engage with society around environmental pollution issues to help to reduce pollution. But taking a step beyond that, I've become interested not only in reducing pollution outside, but also reducing pollution inside. And that's my connection to this community.
Fascinating. And I love the way that John Lennon's music spoke to you in that moment, and what a genius he was. Sister Genti, the Brahma Kumaris, like all faith communities, haven't always had environmental concerns as at the heart of their agenda. And for you, it has now become a fairly central passion of yours. Was there a moment when you broadened your perspective to see that, yes, the world out there, the environment, nature, and my own internal consciousness are inextricably linked?
Thank you for the question, Philippa. And yes, there was a particular moment. I hadn't always been interested in nature, except just to experience the beauty and appreciate that. But not really anything more than that. I've always lived in London, so been in a big city the whole of my life. But I was interested in the Earth Charter when that subject came up at the UN in the 80s, and seeing the link between respect for ourselves and respect for nature and the earth. And so that became a starting point on my own journey. And then in 2009, the same year that Giles was talking about, we began to serve at the COP. And the question was being asked, well, what is the connection of consciousness and climate? Because on one level, it sounds so far apart. And yet, as I began to reflect on that, I could see how, because of my consciousness, if my consciousness is absolutely just caught up with the physical and the mundane, then my interest is in acquisition and materialism and consumerism. I just want. And there's never a state of inner fulfillment. And so I began to see how our overconsumption has led to the situation in terms of the degradation of the environment and also climate change, and how it was a very simple switch. If I could switch to the consciousness of the inner being and come to know myself and find the contentment and happiness within, rather than looking for it outside in a new pair of shoes or a new gadget or anything like that, my contribution to the climate would be one in which my carbon footprint was greatly reduced, and I wouldn't be taking, but rather I would be asking the question, what can I now give to the environment and serve the environment and treat it with love and respect as something which is sacred?
That's a beautiful story. And Giles, I wonder to what extent awareness of environmental issues has been a unifying factor for faith communities, because often there are differences, and yet making this realization that we are inextricably connected with each other and that we have a shared destiny and a shared future. How has this brought faith communities together in your experience?
Thank you, Philippa. It's when I started getting more involved in climate work back in kind of 2012, 2013, and I learned that the COP talk was coming to Paris in 2015, so there was going to be the big conference in Paris. And I looked around actually, and I tried to find somewhere where different faith groups could be involved together and could be engaged in climate. And I knew that there were some Christian networks, but I couldn't find a network which brought together different faith traditions. So I thought, oh, well, we better start one then. And so we did. And so we had a meeting back in February 2014 of really about 40 or 50 people here at St. John's. So we just sent out emails and, you know, how these things do, and gradually people gathered. And so we created this organization called Faith for the Climate, and it's been going ever since. And basically the intention of Faith for the Climate is very simple. It's to increase faith-based climate action in order to reverse the effects of global heating. And we're very carefully kind of non-doctrinal. We don't really mind who we engage with, who we work with, so long as they're engaged in climate. So we have some quite extremes. I mean, we have we have pagans on one end, and we have quite conservative Christians on the other. It's unusual, I think, sometimes to see that broad range of different faith traditions together, working together. But it's because we're very clear that we leave our disagreements at the door, and we come in and we work together on climate, because all faith traditions have at the heart of, or nearly all faith traditions have a care for creation, or whatever you want to call it, care for the world at the heart. And it's what brings us together in so many different ways. So, I mean, really, the answer to your question is, it's a no-brainer, really, and it's absolutely vital. But it's also very moving. I mean, we've set up a capacity building project, and we have calls like this, and there are Jews and Muslims and Christians and Buddhists and Hindus and Sikhs all sitting around, working together on this, and just sharing their experiences, but also the level of commonality between the experiences is abundant. Lots of people say, well, how do we engage the senior members of our communities? And regardless of whether you're Sikh or Christian or whatever, it's always a challenge. How do we take the leaders of our Gurdwaras with us? So we're learning from each other and sharing with each other and building together. And I do want to say that I think the Brahma Kumari's work in this field has been really exceptional over the past years, and I take my hat off to what you've done.
Well, it is a lot of work that goes on, and I know Sister Genti has been at the forefront of that. As we were saying, you've attended the COP conferences, I think, since 2009, and I know you and Mark have met each other at these events. What difference have you seen in that time as far as the general conference perceiving the contribution and role of people of faith and people of spirituality, and actually sitting up and taking notice of what contribution they can make? How has that changed?
Oh, it's changed hugely, because there was a time when activists were on one side and people of faith and spirituality were on another side, and they really thought that they wanted nothing to do with us. And we tried to reach out to them, but they really weren't interested. Until there came a moment, and two things happened together, I suppose, because it was very visible in 2015 at Paris. But what happened was that the political atmosphere in which different traditions really were absolutely polarized, and there was terrorism in the name of faith, and all this was going on. But somehow people managed to change their vision, and as people, they would come together. Although there were a few people who were fundamentalists, it didn't make a difference to the great majority, but rather it actually pulled a great majority of people together. And so activists found themselves coming very close to people of faith. But also, I think the activists realized that if you want to reach the grassroots, then it's through the faith traditions that you can do that. More than 80%, is it 85% of people in the world have some sort of faith that they adhere to whatever extent. That's a huge number. And so if you want to reach people on the grassroots, the way through to that is through the faith people. And so they began inviting us and working with us. And so we found ourselves on different panels sharing these ideas, and they were being received. And also, I think that people began to understand that if you want a change of lifestyle, and people by then had recognized it, to change transport, to change food habits, to change energy requirements, all of these things are very much connected with my lifestyle. And if I want to change my lifestyle, it isn't going to happen through just an intellectual awareness of numbers, but it's going to happen through the heart. When I feel I want to change and I have the capacity and the power to change, which comes through faith, then yes, there can be a difference. And so all these things sort of came together around that time. And so today I think that there's absolutely no one who would question the presence of people of faith at any of these events.
That's great to hear. Mark, I wonder what your experience has been, because you've been to many of these events as well. And as a scientist, I wonder what you would say about the role of our individual mindset when it comes to approaching the subject of change, and how the power of the mind and the power of our thoughts, which is something that religious and spiritual people are putting a lot of focus on, how is that critical in this whole process of expanding our awareness and moving towards something new?
Well, as Sister Genti Sean already succinctly pointed out, the knowledge alone is rarely sufficient to enable us to change behaviors. So most people out there listening know that there are things in their diet or in their exercise habits or in their sleep habits or in their ways of interacting with other people or in how much they read or in whatever it is that they do. They know that there are things that they would live better lives if they change those behaviors. And they also probably have experienced that most of the times they've only been able to actually make that change when there's been either a tragedy which is the sad part of it, but losing a loved one or something else like that, that really kicks you enough to see and to have the strength to make that change, or when they are really strongly swept up by a community that helps and supports that. And to avoid having to only have tragedies as the guide, as the strength for us to make these changes, I think that religions are one of the factors. There's many factors, but it's one of the factors that can help provide us the moral courage. Sister Genti and I used the term moral courage a lot in the last discussions at the last climate conference. And it's that moral courage that the religions can help to bring in to get us from the knowledge, from our intellectual awareness of what we would want to do, what we think we need to do, and the actual strength to carry that out in our individual lives, in our families, in our communities, and even helping through demonstrations or through letters or visits to policymakers, or through the kind of work that we do to carry that in the larger systems. Going specifically to the question of the scientific awareness, so that's on the mindset side, and I'd call that the mindset that we need is this moral courage mindset. Going to the connections between the religious communities and the COPs and the interfaith aspect of that, I'd add two things to that. First off, as Sister Genti pointed out, about 85% of the world, that's the same statistic that I'm familiar with, about 85% of the world would say that they identify themselves with a particular religion, or perhaps interfaith with a particular set of religions. Interestingly, it's flip-flopped in the scientific world. Only about 15% of the scientific world would say that they identify themselves closely and closely practice a particular religion. I'm not sure if that's really true, or if there are many people who are afraid within the scientific community who actually come out with that. But it's definitely a flip-flop of this. And within the scientific community, there's often not the awareness of how important religions are for most of the world. That awareness is developing, and there have been a lot of efforts towards developing that awareness over the last 10 years, because if we want to go from communicating the scientific knowledge that we can bring across into effectiveness, then we have to be very aware of the context of the people that are working towards making that effective. So the policymakers were very aware of that context and the differences in policymakers' way of thinking and scientists' way of thinking. But to really be effective, scientists will also need to learn to work together very well with interfaith communities. And that has been helped immensely by what Giles pointed out, that there have been efforts like his effort. And interestingly, as often is the case, there have been parallel efforts over the last decade that have really pushed the boundary on bringing together interfaith communities around environmental issues. So Giles mentioned what they were doing in the UK. There's a group called Green Faith, which has been doing this internationally. There's also within the World Council of Churches, they have an interfaith liaison committee that goes to the climate conferences and other events and brings together very intentionally an interfaith group to help work. So that gives a more effective communication point for scientific communities to be able to be aware of this and not see this as standoff, just like Sister Genti mentioned, between faith and advocacy, but also between faith and science is often a standoffish standpoint. And perhaps we can come to where we're not competing and where we're not pushing against each other, but working together towards the big changes that we want to make in the world.
Absolutely, collaboration all the way. I was watching on the news last night about the mock COP. I don't know if you've heard about this, but it's when they decided not to go ahead with the COP event in Glasgow this year, a group of young people internationally got together, and they've been holding an online conference with representations from young people from around the world. There was a particularly touching report from a young woman from the Solomon Islands, and the island where she used to live is now completely underwater. And, you know, in terms of shifting mindsets, I think we have to take our hat off to the young people for being ahead of the curve, you know, the likes of Greta Thunberg. Would you say, Giles, that people of faith have been sort of following on towards the back of the curve rather than at the front of the curve? And is that now changing? And what changes within that have you seen even just recently in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. Just before I answer that question, I should say that Green Faith were an early funder of Faith for the Climate as well. So in a very direct way, they've been really helpful to us. Um, I suppose it depends where the curve starts. I mean, the church, speaking for the Church of England, it's certainly been behind the most active activists. We started something called Shrinking the Footprint about 20 years ago. So there was a kind of awareness of the importance of these things early on. And I guess you could probably find pockets within most faith traditions of people who are environmentally active, but it certainly hasn't kind of made it through into the mainstream. And even now, I think, a lot of our work is about trying to raise the profile in the mainstream. I think within Christianity, we've been greatly helped by the Pope and by his amazing encyclical that came out in 2015. And certainly the Church of England has kind of surprised itself by what it's done over the past couple of years. We went for net zero in 2030 at the General Synod recently, really to all of our own surprise. And various people said, well, that's just crazy because it's so difficult. But actually, it's been really good because it's been in focus for us, and we've upped our work as a result of that resolution. So I'd say yes. I'd say the faith traditions are catching up because there's a real recognition of the urgency of it. But I'd also say there's an enormously long way to go, and there are certainly within Christianity there are elements of that there are parts of Christianity who would not see this as a priority because it detracts from the need for personal salvation. So we're struggling even now to get it right the way across the whole of Christianity.
What do you see, Sister Genty, as being the unique contribution that people of faith can bring to the table when it comes to looking at climate change? Because we're talking about, faith communities and the environment. What do we have to offer that other people aren't already offering?
I think the word hope is a very important one. And when we've had faith people come together to discuss what can our contribution really be, and it's always based on this idea of bringing hope to people, because at the moment people feel a little helpless. Climate change seems to be such a big subject, and how do you finish with fossil fuels? It's something that's absolutely huge. And an individual feels, well, what can I do about it? And later we can discuss that also. But when there's a state of hopelessness and helplessness, then you're paralyzed. You're not able even to do the things that you could do. And so faith brings a huge amount of hope, because faith tells you that don't look at things just that are in front of your nose right now. And also don't look at things just on the external physical level. There's something behind it. There's a reason for everything. Nothing happens without a reason. And so like COVID came, and if we explore the things that have led to that, we can see that it's human activity that's actually made that pandemic happen, though some would challenge it, but I think that's actually where we are. Same thing, climate change. It didn't just happen by chance. It happened because human beings made it happen, which on the one side feels a burden. We're responsible, but on the other side, it's a liberation. If we've done this, we can now also do something else. We are responsible for our own future and making the choices that can create a better future. And so the word hope comes in wherever there's faith. And we know that then also the very spiritual concept that it's not just me, but there's someone up above who can give me a huge amount of strength and help us all together move in the right direction. So I think that's been a major thing. I think also the faith communities in many countries led the way in divestment. And also, I know that our own organization in India, especially, I think we're the leading organizational users of renewable energies in India today. We have our own thermal power station that was created on basic principles by our own people. So we're also a research organization, R&D. And so all of this is happening with the power of faith, the power of hope.
I think that's lovely, because for many people looking at, the enormity of the crisis, despair can so quickly set in, and people kind of work on activism as a way of feeling that they can do something, but when they see nothing changing, they very quickly move into despair. And so we do need to protect and care for ourselves and somehow keep our kindling of hope that there is going to be a way through all of this. And maybe that's where a daily practice comes in as a way of sort of loving myself through this time of very difficult change.
Absolutely, I think that's true. I know that it's my own daily practice that keeps that flame of hope alive in my heart, because it shows me that things that are beyond reason can happen. And so if I just look at things of logic and reason, then there's a huge division in the world. How can we come together? But the power of faith is actually, like Giles was saying, we don't need to sit and argue about you believe this, I believe this, but faith makes us realize that we are one family, one community, one planet, one home. And so all of us together can make a difference. The power of cooperation that's existing between the faith communities when it comes to climate change or the environment is enormous. And so that mobilization of energy in a powerful, constructive way is amazing.
I know, Mark, that you're very keen on this whole aspect of integration of all disciplines and people from all backgrounds and faiths pulling together, working together to create coherence. And I wonder if this is another area where people of faith can excel, because a lot of the dialogue is around reversing the changes that we've seen, or at least stabilizing or halting them. But there's a role for a visionary person that can hold out the possibility of a new future and give inspirational ideas for how we can connect with a brighter future. How do you see the scientific and spiritual communities coming together to achieve that?
Well, in maybe two ways in particular. First off is as scientists, of course, we don't speak so much of hope. As people who are scientists, we may very well speak of hope. But as scientists, we can bring out information through sociologists and psychologists that also gives a practical understanding to this message of hope that Sister Genti was talking about, which is that we show over and over that the typical talk that has been often given by climate scientists or by other environmental scientists is sort of almost a fire and brimstone type of talk, where it's one slide after another of the immense environmental damage and the impacts of that on humanity, and how it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And we have what we call the Great Acceleration, which is curves of environmental changes since the 1800s, and in 1950s this started really taking upwards. We can simply expect it to get worse and worse, and we have found that talks like that do only one thing: they scare people, but they don't move them into action. And it's typically if a very clear positive message can be attached to that, and a positive message of both what's being given up and what's being gained through that can be attached to that, that action starts to come. And we can look at a few examples through recent history. For instance, the shift from almost all public areas in many countries like Germany being smoking zones and only small non-smoking areas, to almost all public areas being non-smoking and small smoking areas to still leave the possibility for smokers to have the opportunity to smoke in public places. And these kinds of changes didn't just come about from all of the scary pictures of what smoking does, not only to the smoker's lungs, but to non-smokers' lungs, through passive smoke, but through the possibilities of also hope, where a few small communities actually managed to make that happen, starting partly in the US and a few other countries. And then from that message of hope, that it didn't crash their economies and it didn't kill their gastronomies and so on, that could actually be done. So these messages of hope are important. That's one part where science can actually work very well together with religions, because we can help to have complementary perspectives on issues like that. And the other part is what we were talking about before, that indeed religious communities recently have shown how you can bring together multiple different perspectives around one issue and really work together. So where religions have historically been very much at odds with each other, all sorts of different faiths, around the environmental issues, they have worked together very effectively. And through all of these interfaith communities working on environmental issues, we can learn how not only interfaith, intercultural, but also other intercultural. So the entire range of perspectives that we need, since there's no one right answer or no one right perspective on any specific issue, like how to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, there's not a right answer to that. There's lots of perspectives on that. How do we come together and respect that breadth of perspectives to lead to solutions that society can not only accept, but to really support and move forward to then building even better than we've had before? And that's where I think science and religions can work together very well, especially in the interfaith religious communities.
It's interesting you mentioning there COVID, because obviously, you know, in a way it's strange to be talking about environmental issues because all we've done for the past 9 months is talk about COVID. But I wonder what each of you feels are the lessons that we're taking from the whole pandemic experience in terms of discovering our shared values of mutual respect, of connection with each other, and how you see a post-COVID world in terms of our impact on the environment. Do you think we will see change there? Who would like to go first? Giles.
Thank you, Philippa. I'm sure lots of us have been talking and thinking about this. In fact, I was talking about it this morning. My fear is that we might have a kind of eruption of consumption once we get back to something approaching normal. You know, lots of people haven't been spending as much money as they would have been, so their bank accounts are quite full. B, they haven't had their annual holidays in hot countries. And my fear is that, you know, as soon as we're allowed to, the beaches in Spain will become completely full again and the flights will all take off. And, you know, who's to blame? You know, it's been pretty ghastly, and I don't want to kind of, you know, condemn people who do that, really, on one level. We had so many kind of exciting conversations at the beginning, didn't we, the first lockdown, about how things were different, and we all heard the bird song, and, you know, we saw the decline in carbon emissions and so on. And there was a real sense, certainly here at St. John's, of, you know, really working closely together. It's been harder this time, but I do think that, you know, it's the sense of engagement and the sense of community, I think, will last. I hope will last. If we can make it, if we can do what we can to help it really be bedded in and continue. I think we're sort of also learning from the technology. I mean, Mark, I agree with you completely about science and technology. You know, we couldn't have had this kind of conversation before, because we wouldn't have used Zoom in the way that we did. You know, WhatsApp is a remarkable thing in some ways, because it brings together communities. So we're learning about practical ways of working together, which I think will continue. Sorry, that was a rather rambling answer, but I think our sense of mutual dependence is greater now than it was a year ago, not least because we've all been so affected by the virus, and so, but also the sense that we can make a difference.
I think there is a kind of a collective sense that we are on the precipice of huge change, and we don't necessarily know what that change is going to look like, but, you know, we've all experienced it. And, you know, Mark's point about, you know, changing from no smoking public spaces, you know, from smoking to no smoking public spaces. And in a way, the COVID experience has shown us how quickly change can happen in society as well, if we mobilize people in the right way. But I know this is something, Sister Genti, that you have also been looking at in terms of the values that have come out of the COVID experience, like kindness, like respect, like cooperation. Are there any other values that you see that we can draw from this experience that could be useful as we go forwards?
The word corona has a very interesting connection with a very similar word in Hindi, karuna, and karuna means compassion. And so I personally have seen a huge amount of compassion emerge in people. So people ready to cook for others, people ready to deliver food to those who are vulnerable and haven't been able to look after themselves. So there's been a wave of compassion that's come about. And of course, we saw the applaud for the key workers and things like this, but that appreciation that we perhaps didn't have before and took for granted, And now there is that appreciation of what others are doing, and also the desire to support them and help them, the gratitude. So appreciation, gratitude, compassion, these are the things I'm seeing that have emerged. But also, I think a greater value for life. Here's a personal story that went around a lot early days was a 92-year-old man leaving hospital in Italy, and he's presented with a bill, and it's a few €1,000, and he's in tears. And a young doctor seeing him feels a lot of compassion and says, "Look, you don't have to worry about the bill. I'll sort that out." And he says, "I'm not worried about the bill. I'm just thinking I've had every day of my life the gift of breath from God, and I didn't say thank you. I'm here for 4 days. I'm given a bill, and it's just made me appreciate the value of my breath." And so, one little story, but the value of life, the value of another human being's life, and what can I do to support them and help them?
We're going to start looking in a moment about the personal changes that we can make. But before we do, Mark, it would be nice just to have a word from you on this, the difference between the personal shift and transformation and the changes in systems, the systemic change. Because if we look at things like, taking flights, for instance, we learned the other day that it's 1% of the population that are responsible for 50% of the flights that are taken. And it's very easy for people to think, well, we need to sort, the big guys who are causing all this problem first, before you start pointing the finger at me as one individual. What would you say to someone who approaches change in that way, as saying, well, let them get their house in order first?
Well, I would say that it's very important to understand that changes that we need towards a more sustainable society, or using the word more, a society that's more in planetary health, they won't come about only through systemic changes. They won't only come about top down from some type of amazing politicians who just happen to get elected and happen to get re-elected, even if they're doing things that a lot of the population doesn't like and is not necessarily economically great and is not necessarily supporting industry and so on, but they still manage to get re-elected because they have some type of magical power and they can implement all of the policies that we need. We need the systemic changes, but it's not going to happen through the systemic changes alone, and it's not going to happen through the individual changes alone. We can have communities as large as we want that say that we're ready to jump on board with commitments towards everything that from renewable energy to changing our mobility habits, to changing our consumption habits, to changing our eating habits, to changing the way that we interact with each other, to changing towards interacting with each other more equally. We still will not find a growth of those communities if that's not coherent. So what we really need is the combination. We need these communities that are absolutely passionate about seeing developments towards a world that's more oriented on the common good. And they have to be brought together in the sense of the systemic changes that we need in order to actually make that happen on a large scale. So you can think of the smoking zones and non-smoking zones as an example. If you had 10% of the smokers who say, okay, we understand, we really respect, we really want to change, we'll only smoke in these very small islands here. It would help. It would have helped to reduce the amount of smoke, but only a small part. Without the connection of that to the large systemic component of setting up laws for the zoning of areas, then this wouldn't have actually happened. But at the same time, if the policymakers had said, okay, too many of our grandmothers have died of lung cancer, too many of our grandfathers have died of early heart attacks, we're going to do something about this. And they had tried to push it against the society that didn't want to support it and didn't have large groups of people who were really willing to go out and on the edge to support this, then it also wouldn't have gotten through. And that's why anybody who says and wants to point the finger at the one or the other, I'd say, open your eyes, to the fact that both need to be there. And the longer we're pointing fingers, the less at each other, the less we'll be pointing fingers in the direction of where we really need to go together.
Perfect. Well, we invited some of the students at the Brahma Kumaris to share with us their own personal journeys that they've been on with adopting some of these changes that are being put forward in this initiative organised by Living the Change, which is looking at alternative transport, green transport, and also a plant-based diet. And we're going to watch the first of our little video presentations now as we go on a journey with Sharon and Natasha.
Buongiorno, come stai?
Hello, very well, thank you. And you?
Natasha?
Yes, Natasha.
I'm very well, thank you. I noticed that you're cycling regularly. I like cycling. It's just that I have a few reservations. Like, is it safe?
Well, I think it is safe. I started cycling with very short journeys and I become more and more confident. And I now cycle everywhere.
How does it compare with public transport or driving a car in London?
It gets you to places quicker. It helps you to incorporate exercise in your daily life. And it also helps with air pollution and congestion.
That is one of my concerns, the air pollution. Do you not find that you're inhaling toxic fumes?
Yeah, I also was concerned about air pollution at first. Then I discovered a new research that indicates that cyclists are less exposed to air pollution. And that's because they tend to spend less time in highly congested areas as compared as people that drives or people using public transport or even walkers. So it's actually better.
What inspired you to start cycling in London?
Well, I took up cycling because I wanted to avoid public transport by commuting to work in central London, but also to protect my back because I don't need to put any weight on it. I take everything that I need in my bike panniers.
Do you not find that it's cold in winter?
Not at all. After 10 minutes cycling, you warm up quite nicely. And if it rains, I just put some waterproofs on top of my own clothes. And so I feel protected.
Are you wearing vegan shoes?
Yes, I am. How do you know?
I used to work in fashion for many years. Are you a vegan?
Yes, I've been a vegan for almost a year. And I've also been trying to move away from animal wear as well, but it takes time.
Do you find a vegan diet actually provides you with enough energy to go to all those places that you cycle to?
Of course it does. The energy we need for exercise comes from carbohydrate, and carbohydrates are in plant-based food. There are lots of athletes that are vegan, and even the gladiators in ancient Rome were vegetarian. Do you do anything for the environment?
Well, I rarely buy things that I don't need. I darn all my socks, I sew all my clothes, and I upcycle. I'm a green champion as well for the Brahma Kumaris, the Green Initiative. And since I've been following their training, I take great pleasure in monitoring my smart meter. And I have noticed that my energy consumption has definitely decreased. I walk everywhere that's feasible. And I tend to use very little energy. I confine my heating to one room. I'm very mindful about the water that I use. And also, since working in the Brahma Kumari's kitchen, preparing vegetables, I've noticed that I actually use everything. Zero waste. So from micro to macro.
Oh, that's amazing. And what's your name again?
Sharon O'Regan. Rhymes with O-vegan.
Wonderful. Thanks very much to Sharon and Natasha, and also to Rajesh, who helped with the creation of that video. I feel a little bit put to shame that I don't darn my socks, so maybe that's something on my next to-do list. But Giles, is this something that you've seen in London, partly in response to coronavirus, that people are on their bikes more than they used to be?
Oh, definitely, yeah. I live between the Blackfriars Road and Westminster Bridge Road, and well, there are many fewer people commuting now, of course, than there were, but I saw a steady increase in the number of people using the new cycle routes on Blackfriars Road until Corona, and certainly in commuting hours, it was really busy until then. Now it's quieter, but I think the proportion of people on their bikes is higher compared with the number of people in their cars.
Wonderful. And what about you, Mark? Have you made changes in the way you use transport?
Not really, because I already basically bike and take the train and public transportation to most places that I go. So in 9 years of commuting around Germany, I believe I've flown once within Germany, and one time back and forth. And otherwise, I take the train everywhere. So and like to take the bike when possible. So there's not been much of a change that I've seen done personally, but I've seen changes in others. And perhaps in contrast to Giles's experience in Germany, we have what we call pop-up bike lanes, which doesn't mean that the bike lanes pop up, but it means that they basically take a road and they mark in a new bike lane, because they've recognized that the increase in bike traffic during this lockdown period has been so significant that they need to make more space for the bicycles, so that first off, they can be safe next to the traffic, and second off, so that they can keep distance between each other when they're cycling. Otherwise, they're too crowded up and not being able to keep the distance regulations that we have in Germany. And so, and that has been the subject of a lot of study, and I'd say that the verdict is still out on how well that is really working and how to make that something that is a lasting change and not just a short-term change. As Giles mentioned, I would agree completely that there's the risk that not only will we go, so to speak, back to normal, but we'll even overshoot to, for a while, going back to worse in terms of environmental and sustainability considerations, and then level out again. So I hope that we can make use of some of what we're learning out of this and these kinds of changes that have happened.
I hear great things as well about the electric bicycle, which gives you a little bit of help with some of the hills. So that's maybe something to look into. We're going to come on now and look at our next video, which is looking at growing vegetables. And again, Sister Genti, this is something that as an organization we have really engaged with in terms of in India, they now grow so many of their own vegetables, and they even meditate with their vegetables to try and increase the yield. How do you see this development within the organization?
We have what we call not just organic agriculture, but yogic agriculture. And it's actually a very traditional, ancient idea in India that whatever you do is sacred. And so before you do it, you pause for a moment and you offer up a prayer, and in our case, meditation. And it started in Maharashtra when one particular farming family felt that they had to do something in their own initiative to try and combat the state of hopelessness of farmers around them in their community, because things were not good at all, various reasons. Drought and infertile seeds are two of the major factors there. But here, an infertile seeds, not because of nature, but because of a food product company. I won't name names here, but it was an imposition put on farmers. So here this family started to meditate on the seeds before planting, during plantation, then every day out in the fields, sending those good vibrations, and harvest time again the same. So the same principle all the time, just share good vibrations through meditation. And what they found was that not only was the yield higher, but in particular, they found that in terms of the positive impact of insects, there's a good bacteria and the not so good. So the positive factor of insects and bacteria was that was supporting the nutrition for the plants. And the reduction of pests was also marked. And so all of these factors meant that their neighbors started doing the same. And from Maharashtra, it's now gone to Gujarat and also Rajasthan, but also Punjab. And so various areas in India are experimenting with this, and universities, of course, are doing a lot of research to get all the statistics necessary for this.
And this is maybe another contribution of people of faith, because the church has always taught us to say a prayer before we eat. And I know in the Brahma Kumaris, no one eats without first taking a moment of silence and a moment of reverence for the food that is on their plate and how it arrived on their plate, and having conscious awareness around what you're consuming physically, and also energetically making sure that the food that you consume is of the highest vibrational quality as possible. And this is a lovely practice that has always been there in the Brahma Kumaris.
Absolutely. And, you know, they say that the way to a person's soul or heart is through the stomach. And it's absolutely true that if you're sharing good vibrations in the whole process of buying, cooking, etc., then that food, you know, you talk about the home cooking and mother's love in the food. Well, it's a fact that those good vibrations are there in the food, and they impact not only the physical body, but they also impact the consciousness. And so the love that's being generated is actually reaching the other individual. And so it's a way to make good friends with everyone.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's something that every single one of us can do, because we all eat once, twice, 3 times a day if we're very fortunate. And to really put that energy of love into the food is a great way of supporting the people in our family and in our community. Well, our next video is from David Goodman, who's up in Leeds. And I think, like many of us, as the lockdown came, many of us instinctively felt like finding our seeds and growing our own vegetables. So let's see how David got on with his allotment up in Leeds.
Hi everyone, I'm David. I've been vegetarian for ages and I now have a completely plant-based diet. Living with other vegans means we eat loads of veggies, so I decided to grow some at home, then was really fortunate to get an allotment close by in a very beautiful setting. As it was mostly grass and weeds, it needed work, and I opted for no dig, as this doesn't disturb the finely balanced ecosystem in the soil. Rather, it mimics nature, which just drops organic matter onto the surface. So down went the cardboard, on went the compost, and in went the plants. No dig requires plenty of compost, which means we've reduced our use of black bin bags, as more stuff now goes into the compostable bags, which can go straight onto the pile, and the worms love them. Well, watching seedlings silently pop up is nothing short of miraculous. The challenge, however, is to nurture them through to harvest, especially when your prize crop is munched close to the finish line. Of course, Mother Nature is resilient and can regenerate while simultaneously giving generously from her incredible abundance. And observing this engenders a deep sense of gratitude and appreciation. I do find myself saying thanks when I pick something. I've also noticed that as I get my hands in soil and physically respect and care for nature, it becomes easier to more deeply respect myself and others. After all, eating some homegrown, chemical-free, nutrient-dense organic food is an act of self-care. Of course, the benefit of home growing is that we eat more seasonal vegetables, which are healthy for us, and I'm certainly now much more tuned into the cycle of the changing seasons. And finally, I experience gardens as healing spaces and places for quiet reflection. As William Davis said, "What is this life if full of care we have no time to stand and stir?" And as I spread peaceful vibrations, perhaps I'm helping things grow better.
That was a lovely video diary there from David in Leeds, with help from Nick as well. Thanks to both of you for that. And very inspiring. I'm actually still eating my spinach and my Swiss chard that I grew in the summer, still rainbow chard as well. It just keeps on growing. So, you know, here we are almost December. It's been well worth the effort that I put into it. Giles, for you, part of the work that you do is around mobilizing change through coming out with joint declarations, pledges, you know, lists of things that will inspire people. How successful do you think they've been in making people commit and actually do what they say they're going to do?
I think those who are already convinced, it's been really effective. I mean, it was good hearing about David, what David's doing, and you know, what the speaker on the first video is doing. And I think many of us would be able to come up with similar lists. And I guess it has expanded. I mean, I spoke to somebody yesterday, I went for a walk yesterday with somebody who said, "Oh, I've listened to you, I hardly ever eat red meat now." And I was quite pleased, really. So I think it is expanding, but I think it's very incremental. And it's quite difficult, if you're not already kind of very personally engaged in it, it's quite difficult to get people to make the change without coming across as self-righteous and, you know, virtue signaling. But I think they are useful. I mean, we might be talking about some pledges in a minute, and I think it's good to have them. I mean, things do happen by, there's the nudge theory, isn't there? That, you know, you could, it's incremental changes which make the difference. Things like free-range eggs is a good example. You know, now you go into most of the supermarkets and they have free-range eggs. You know, they're probably not much better than barn eggs, but they're a bit better. And then you also have quite a lot of organic eggs because people, you can see that there are changes. So I'm hopeful, but I think it is quite difficult to get the changes that we need.
Sister Genti, you obviously have been vegetarian as part of your practice, and the Brahma Kumaris has quite kind of clear guidelines in things that you can adopt in your life that will support you in your meditation life. But there has also recently been quite a lot of discussion around moving completely to plant-based diet and vegan. What have you observed has been the sort of the light bulb moment for people on their journey towards adopting plant-based diet? What makes them think, right, I'm ready for this?
I've noticed that health has become a major factor in making people make the shift to vegetarian diet, because they've now understood that the sort of chemicals that are used in for farm animals and industrial agriculture and things like this are not very good for the system. And so conditions of health issues are a big factor in making people shift. And that also is not just for vegetarian, but also for veganism. That's been a major thing. And the second thing is that in terms of the environment, if you see the amount of land that's needed for a plant-based diet as distinct to any other diet is such a huge difference. I think just in terms of water consumption, it would be a ratio of 1 to 8. You would need 8 times more water for a non-plant diet than you would for a plant-based diet. So when people understand that this is the state that we are in and that it's something that we can do, we can make a difference. And yes, if it's just meatless Monday, well, fine, begin with 1 day a week. And when you see also the impact of all of these things on your mind, I think you begin to realize that it's something worth exploring. And usually I tell people, well, try it for a week and see what difference it makes for you. And even just 1 week of having plant-based diet makes them feel a lot lighter and have a great deal more energy than they would have otherwise. And they try for another few weeks and that's it. And by then I think they've decided what they want to do. So it's not such a difficult thing to do. A little bit of awareness and the change can happen.
And small steps, you know, one thing at a time rather than a complete eradication overnight.
Maybe. For some people, little steps are easier. And for other people, I make a decision and I make a change. That's sometimes easier for people also.
It's like pulling a plaster off. For some people, it's easier just to go for it in one go. Mark, this is obviously an area that sort of touches on scientific insight into providing alternatives for a plant-based diet. But also we've got the economy, and there's some powerful lobbies there that are kind of holding us into our old food patterns. How much of your work has been looking at this whole issue of the food that we eat?
So my professional work is not very strongly related to eating habits. My personal work has been very involved in that. So the academic research work that I do at our institute has not been so focused on nutrition. But I've had a lot of personal experience of experimenting around with this and with communities and with inspiration, and have found myself have switched to a largely 99%, I'd say, plant-based diet about 5 years ago. And what I find is it's very important to make clear that that's, first off, that kind of a shift can be very much inspired through health and can be very supported through health, as Sister Genti mentioned. When others ask me about it, Sister Genti, I tend to push people a little harder and tell them, try it for 3 weeks instead of trying it for 1 week. A month is too long, but 3 weeks is long enough that you really, really start to see the impacts on health. And indeed, what I find through discussions is that health tends to be the inroads to getting people interested. They may be interested through their environmental consequences, but health is the inroads to getting them so interested that they'll try it themselves. And what I bring into this, however, is a principle that principles that I've been developing is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Exactly as you've all have said in different ways, that not everybody can follow a plant-based diet. There are, as far as I understand, there are some people who have so many food allergies that it would be extremely difficult for them in the current societal setting that we have to actually follow a plant-based diet. We have a friend who is like that. So for these people, then see what they can do within their dietary limitations to follow a diet that's as consistent as possible with what they do. And this is where the last thing I'd point out here is that these kinds of videos that we've just seen are reminiscent of what we were talking before about different perspectives. They'd be very inspiring to some communities, and they'd be actually scary to other communities, to other people who would watch these, because they'd see this as a push so far in a direction that they're not ready to go, that it would scare them off. And so this is where I think this is so important that we learn scientifically, based on good sociological and psychological information, how can we put together these kinds of messages so that they work, not only work with the various audiences that we're working with and communities that we're working with, but they respect the messages and give possibilities in communities that wouldn't take up these particular messages, but would take up another message that's good, maybe not perfect, but that's good. So how can we bring all of that together? And this is where I see this great opportunity that we have in the interfaith communities and the work of those together with scientific communities.
Excellent. Well, we're going to be having a meditation in a short while, and we thought it would be nice to use the meditation as a chance to really reflect deeply on what is my next step on this journey of personal change and transformation. But before we do that, Giles, it might be nice to just look at the points that have been put forward by Living the Change, whose work we're supporting with this event today, because like many other groups and organisations, they have come up with a bit of a 10-point plan for things that we can really ask ourselves and prompt ourselves with. Would you like to just talk us through those? And maybe we can look at a slide that has got them on whilst you're doing that.
So we've mentioned Green Faith already. Green Faith, I think, were responsible for creating Living the Change. And a couple of years ago, they produced these 3 commitments in transport, environment, and food, I think. So here are some possibilities. I think many of the people who are watching this call may be doing these already. But in terms of transport, we can walk or use a bicycle, use public transport more. fly more efficiently, fly less, consider buying a hybrid or an electric car, reduce our car use, share cars, share travel, and maybe create a new commitment. And this is an example of, I mean, there are various forms of pledges around. There's another one organised by the Climate Coalition. And the idea is that you can sign up to these. So you can go to the website, you can go to Living the Changes website, and you can make these commitments yourself. So if we go on to the next slide. So in terms of energy, again, some of these may be familiar to you. Replace your light bulbs with LEDs, dry your clothes instead of using a tumble dryer. This third one is one that produced some discussion in the UK, because it's around air conditioning, and not many of us have air conditioning, but obviously if you're in a hot part of the world, then the air conditioning makes a huge difference and can drastically increase your carbon footprint. But again, you can turn your thermostat down in the winter. I'm actually quite chilly at the moment because the heating's not on in this room. Renewable energy. I hope that most people have switched to renewable energy, but if not, it's not complicated. Look at installing solar cells if you're lucky enough to have a roof or somewhere that you can put them. And also talk in your spiritual community about reducing the energy use. And there may be other things as well. And then on the next slide, which is about food, again, we've touched on this already, but can we reduce our food waste? Can we eat increasingly plant-based food? Can we reduce our cheese or dairy or our meat consumption? And if we are eating meat, can we reduce the high carbon footprint meat, i.e. beef or lamb, and go for chicken? One of the things I have a real problem with is eating fish because of the way that we are treating the sea. So I cut out fish a very long time ago. So that would be my new commitment, number 11, is not eating fish because of the way that the sea is being treated. So these are examples of pledges, and each of them are, relatively small. Many of them are quite small steps. But if you put them all together, then you start making the difference. And the more of a difference we make, going back to Mark's point about the difference between the structural and the individual, the more of a difference we make individually, the more pressure there is on governments in order to change the structures. And I think that's another important thing that can really bring about the difference, is when the groundswell of people start expecting or hoping that there will be policy changes.
And it's about inspiring other people without lecturing them as well, isn't it? And I think that's one of the nice things about these pledges is you can just forward it as an email to someone and they can see what they feel ready for. And I know on the Faith for the Climate website, you can write your own personal pledge as well. And we are going to be giving the web addresses for these organisations at the end of our session today. So you might just want to grab paper and pencil to jot those down in a few moments' time. But we're going to move into our slightly more experiential sequence now. And we're going to have a few moments looking at a slideshow which really takes us onto a journey of experiencing silence. And Sister Genti, I think if I could bring you in here just for a few comments before we look at this, because your whole life has been supporting people in their process of personal change. And one of the tools that you use is taking people into an experience of silence where they can really feel that still small voice within that is always peaceful, is always still. What for you is so life-changing about connecting to this whole experience of silence?
You used the word life-changing, and I think that's what it's actually all about. Because otherwise, we are so busy, and even if I'm in a quiet environment, I create noise. I want music on my phone. I want something to entertain me. And we try and destroy that silence around us sometimes in nature even, but also just in here, there's so much constantly going on in here that there's no space for myself, no time for myself or for silence. And so once I begin to understand that I need to nourish myself, just as I need to nourish the physical body, that's absolutely vital. In the same way, I need to nourish the soul. And the way I can do this is through silence. because what I'm doing in silence is connecting with the goodness that lies within every single human being. And when I connect with that goodness, I'm able to experience it and feel it, emerge it, and then use it in my life. And so it's a very simple way in which I begin to realize how powerful silence is and how useful it is, especially in uncertain times like there are today.
So it's a real way of refreshing ourselves. And as you say, many people try and avoid silence because they find it awkward. And in this next video, there are a few moments of silence. So not to be afraid of that, but just to let the silence be there and see what it brings up in you, see what connection you can make with that tangible experience of silence. So let's enjoy the slide presentation together. And then after that, Sister Genti, if you could lead us into a meditation, that would be super. I'll introduce you though before we do that.
Have you found your silence? From surround sound to surround silence. Silence is a soundless valley in the early morning mist. Silence in the calm of the ocean before the coming of the storm. Silence in the deafening, noiseless vastness of the desert. Silence in that awesome panorama from the mountain peak. There is the muffled silence at the heart of every forest, as trees stand tall and thick in a conspiracy to absorb the slightest sound. On the last peal of the village bell, you can dry the sounds as it fades into silence.
A very beautiful and powerful experience of silence, which in our world is actually quite hard to find. And yet, of course, silence is resident within each and every one of us. When we turn our thoughts within, we can connect with that. As we close with our meditation now, we thought we could use this as a chance to really reflect on the inspirations that we've heard today and maybe take a personal commitment to one of them and really hold that as a thought within ourselves that we can carry away from this session, that I can really make a difference in my life by adopting that change. But now, Sister Genti, if I could invite you to just lead us in our closing meditation with your own thoughts as you take us into an experience of the silence that lies at the heart of each one of us.
Thank you, Philippa. just reflecting on the things I've been hearing about, I ask myself the question, what is my relationship with nature? And in the inner silence, I realize that the inner being is surrounded by nature. This amazing physical body of mine is nature itself. An amazing creation that gives me the experience of life, an instrument that's able to do awesome things. The earth, the air, water, fire, space, all have come together to give me this beautiful nature, this gift from the universe. The heart fills with gratitude for this. Now I go on another journey, deeper and deeper into myself. And to my surprise, I find that there's a space inside which is sacred, where only I can enter. And in this space, there is stillness, there is silence, there is peace. I connect with my innermost self. Peace feels comfortable and very familiar. In my original state of being, I am peace. And in this state of peace, I see the beauty of the soul within, filled with goodness. And I begin to sense a connection with all other human beings, beings of beauty, beings of peace. An eternal bond connects the entire human family together. And yes, I realize that apart from the goodness within, I also carry aspects that I need to explore, patches that I need to transform. But now having touched the goodness, I have the confidence and the power to know that transformation is possible. But for now, I simply enjoy the loving connection with the whole of humanity and beyond, with all living creatures, sacred beings who have a right to life, and beyond, to nature and all the elements that make up nature. I have seen nature change. As a child, I saw nature constantly abundant and beautiful. And today, I see nature having been scarred and ravaged. And I make a commitment just as I learn to respect myself, I want to extend that to all human beings, to all forms of life, and to nature. I will respect every aspect of this planet. And I send my thoughts of love and peace to the planet and everything on this planet. Holding this awareness, I come back to the physical dimension and the things here, but holding this experience alive in my heart so that it informs all that I do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Genty. That was not only beautiful, but really, really profound. And I think it's a wonderful example of how people of faith can really play a part in helping people shift and make a connection to the greater whole. So thank you so much for leading us in our closing meditation. I certainly feel inspired to include as part of my daily meditation more time in really thinking about nature and sending healing energy, loving energy, supporting energy for this process of change that the earth is going through at the moment. Mark and Giles, if you'd like to unmute yourselves and come from the soundless world back into sound, just to share with us any inspirations that you got from that for your next personal step on your journey. Anything from either of you?
Thank you so much. A deeper sense of connectedness, always, that sense that we are all in this together. And if we work together and we are silent together and reflect together, we can bring about changes together. I don't know whether Mark wanted to mention sacred people, sacred earth as something that we might do. Right?
Good. Well, first off, thank you so much, Sister Genti, for sharing that silent meditation and that guided meditation on silence, and that perspective on what silence can bring us. And what I take especially from it is what I take and deepen every time is the value of listening, and that we tend to be so caught up in speaking and expressing ourselves and thinking that we know the way and that we need to tell everybody else that. And we can listen to each other and we can listen to nature, and it takes silence to do that. And I'm not very strong in that. So everybody that helps me in a step on my way towards that, I'm appreciative of it. Giles mentioned the sacred people, sacred earth. So we've talked about some of these principles for changing and for living in consistency with sustainability. And Green Faith, an organization, has put out a call for support for events that they're putting together leading up to the next Earth Day. And they call it Sacred People, Sacred Earth. And they have an action network on that where you can sign up to support the 10 demands that they put out for mostly towards policymakers, but also towards communities to support the changes that we're looking for, and find out more information then through a newsletter. And I believe then the website for that will be sent at the end of this as well.
Thank you, Mark. I think likewise, I think we were all really touched by that meditation. It just somehow took us to the heart of what we've been talking about this afternoon, the importance of silence, the importance of building our faith practices so that we can support ourselves and support each other through what will undoubtedly be very challenging times in the months and years to come. Now, we said that we'd put the websites on the screen, so maybe we can just do that now. If you'd like to jot them down, then do so. But also, if you would like to email into us here at Global Cooperation House, then we will send you an email with all the links of the different organisations that we have talked about today, whether that's Faith for the Climate, Living the Change, or this latest initiative that Mark has been talking about. I don't know if we're able to bring that screen up now. Is that possible? Maybe we'll do that just at the very close. So thank you all so much for your time, for sharing so much of yourselves, and also thank you for the work that each of you personally doing to raise our understanding and awareness of this issue, because it's the hearts and minds of each and every one of us that together can make a difference and restore health and beauty to our sacred earth, our sacred home. It's been a real honour and pleasure to spend time with you this afternoon, this evening, and thanks to all of you who have joined in from wherever you are. I hope likewise you feel inspired to reflect on your own daily lives and what you can do to make a small contribution towards the whole. So until next time, until our next event, I wish you well, keep safe, keep healthy, keep happy, keep that silence in you as you go from here, and we look forward to being together one time very soon. Thank you so much and goodbye.